Welcome to this exclusive Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security interview on defining Canada's threat landscape. My name is Peter Engelke, and I'm a senior fellow with the GeoStrategy Initiative in the Scowcroft Center, where I lead our foresight work here at the Atlantic Council. I am joined today by Ian Brzezinski, who is a resident senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center's Transatlantic Security Initiative. I think, as many of you know, Ian brings to the Council more than 2 decades of experience in national security matters, having served in senior policy positions in the U.S. Department of Defense and the U.S. Congress. And most notably, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO policy from 2001 to 2005. Over the past year, the Scowcroft Center hosted 3 virtual workshops on defining Canada's geostrategic landscape. Ian attended these workshops and, of course, has always contributed his brilliant insights. The workshops focused on how geopolitics, a changing climate, and emerging technologies are impacting Canadian national security and defense. Now, we have analyzed the findings from these workshops in an upcoming report, which will be published in the coming weeks. So I'm thrilled to have Ian here with us to surface some of the critical questions we explored in our report and hear his perspectives on the biggest security threats facing Canada today. So welcome, Ian.
Thank you for including me.
Of course, as always. So please, let's start with the most basic question I think I can think of, which is, what is Canada's role in the world as you see it?
Well, to answer that question, you might ask another question, which is what distinguishes Canada in the world. It's an exemplar of democracy. It stands out as one of the preeminent democratic states. It's one of the 10 biggest economies in the world. It's no surprise that it's a member of the G7, and it hosted the G7 summit just a couple months ago. And with that comes a fair amount of power, influence, credibility, but also responsibility. And that responsibility involves leveraging its power and its influence, its economic capacity, its military capacity to further, to protect, to advance the values and interests of the democratic community of nations, of which Canada is a key leader. Mm-hmm. And looking forward, I say one of the most important things it needs to do is to develop the military capacities that will enable it to contribute to that dimension of the interests and values of the democratic community of nations, and to do so with a level of force and capabilities commensurate to its stature.
Mm. And as we know that the world is changing rapidly geopolitically, right? And so there are not only new types of threats, which we'll get to here in a moment, but there's also new actors on the scene, or emerging actors on the scene, and emerging forces in the world that make the world a more complex and dynamic place. And that's as true for Canada, if not more true for Canada than any other country in the world. In part because it's an Arctic nation, but only in part because it's an Arctic nation. So I'm wondering if you might tell us a little bit about how you see how Canada's Department of National Defense, its armed forces, can effectively balance between its priorities across 3 enormous arenas, which is the Arctic, the Transatlantic arena, and the Indo-Pacific arena.
Well, those are 3 arenas of increasing challenge in a world that's becoming smaller and smaller because of the inevitable trend of globalization. So Canada can no longer assume that the cold and vast Arctic and the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, are protective realms that kind of isolated from the vicissitudes of world affairs. Now it's more directly buffeted, and climate change, of course, is changing the northern frontier. So when it comes down to its security interests and its security responsibilities, both at home and abroad, Canada has to do more. Mm-hmm. And right now, it doesn't have the force structure to do that. Yeah. It doesn't have the force structure even today to really monitor properly its own perimeter, particularly in the face of global warming and the increased access the world has, including our adversaries, to the Arctic. Until recently, Canada's spending on defense has only been about 1.2%. Of its GDP compared to the NATO standard of 2%, and it's good news it's reaching 2% today and is committed to 5% because it's going to need that money. Mm-hmm. But it's worse than Spain. Now here's Spain, an economy of $1.6 trillion, a population's a little bit larger than that of Canada's, spends only about 1.4% of its GDP on defense, yet has a force that's more than 2 times the size of Canada's, 168,000 professional soldiers. So Canada's got to step up its game militarily if it's going to address the security interests and challenges it faces in those three realms, the Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Pacific.
Right, and so you mentioned Spain a couple of times, and that reminds me that
Spain is not a good example to follow.
Well, a good example of an ally and partner, right? So how should Canada be thinking in terms of its allies and partners as the world changes? I mean, how did those relationships change? How should it be working differently with its allies and partners as the years tick by and we have a different world facing us?
Well, in the realm of security, particularly in the realm of military security, it has to increase its force posture so it can do more to defend itself and to do more with others. So in its immediate vicinity, it needs to increase its naval capacities and its air defense capacities to defend its immediate territory. And the Arctic is opening up.
Yeah.
Yet Canada has just a handful of almost obsolete submarines. It's going to invest hopefully in new ones, but hasn't made that decision yet.
Yeah.
It is expanding its fleet with some new frigates coming online, but I'm not sure that's going to be enough.
Right.
Particularly when it comes down to the challenges of dealing with subsurface warfare and intelligence operations in the Arctic. The Arctic is going to be probed as the world, particularly our adversaries, want to get into the Arctic, want to probe around, want to exploit its resources, and to secure military advantage over us.
Right.
Also, for its own defense, but also in collaboration with the United States, it needs to do more to accelerate their modernization of NORAD, our shared air defense initiative that Canada also benefits from. It is becoming stressed in part because the technologies and radars we have there are aged, but also because more sophisticated missile systems, hypersonic missiles and such, are coming online. They're going to stress the current capabilities of NORAD. Canada has a responsibility and has an interest to be more engaged internationally militarily in collaboration with the United States, its NATO allies, and its allies in the Indo-Pacific. And that's going to require capacity, military capacity, that it doesn't have right now. So it wants to balance those three realms. Investment is going to be key.
Exactly.
Investment, but also operational engagement.
And you've mentioned now the Arctic in the context of a changing climate a couple of times. I'm wondering if if we could dive a little bit more into how you see the Arctic changing and what that means not just for Canada but for all the Arctic nations and even those nations that are not Arctic nations, like for example China, right? And what that means for Canada's geopolitics, for Canada's defense posture, its operations, and all the other things that we're talking about in this conversation. Are there other features of that equation that you see being critical for Canada and how it thinks of the future and thinks of what it needs to be doing?
Climate change is a devastating national security phenomenon. For the Canadians, as an Arctic nation, with one of the largest or second largest Arctic perimeter, so to speak, I mean, the impact is already being seen in almost in real time. Ice melt, the weakening of tundra, all of which makes it more difficult to operate in that realm and which opens up that realm to our adversaries. But it's just not on the home front. Climate change is causing massive dislocations around the world. It's drying up parts of the world so they're no longer agriculturally productive. Massive displacements of people and population are occurring as a result of this. All of this adds to volatility, uncertainty. It creates dynamics that are being exploited by our adversaries. And sitting at home is not going to address those problems. It's going to require Canada, in collaboration with its allies and partners, to address those problems firsthand, forward, so to speak, not waiting for the problems to come to Canada's shores. And they will if we're passive.
So last question for you. So speaking of a world that's changing quickly and exceedingly dynamic and requires much nimbleness of thought, of action, of policy, and that's sort of the landscape of emerging technologies, right? Which are, every country wants to acquire and use for its own purposes, for national security and other purposes, for its economy, but also it can be a threat at the same time. And there are, of course, many dimensions to this equation and that are of relevance to Canada, one of which, of course, is on the input side, right? Critical minerals being exceedingly important for defense-related technologies of all kinds, as we're discussing all the time in the conversation of the United States and China. So I'm wondering if you might comment a little bit about how you see that in the Canadian context.
Well, when you're talking about technology and technology inputs, one is Canada's a significant economy, but a middle-sized power. So it probably is not going to have the kind of vast technological spectrum that the United States has. When it comes down to natural resources, you know, of course it's got huge energy resources, but it also has largely untapped critical mineral resources.
Right.
And critical minerals are an incredibly important dimension to our civilian industry, or all the civilian products, from our cell phones to our toasters that use the magnets and other special minerals and materials that come from the critical minerals realm. Those are on short supply, and right now there's a dominant position, a monopoly position the Chinese have. Canada still has this capacity that can be more aggressively tapped to its economic benefit and to the technological, economic, and security benefit of its allies, including the United States. And for that reason, it's no surprise that Canada has become a very popular place for American officials and industrialists concerned about critical minerals, but also from Europe and from our friends in the Indo-Pacific.
Right, exactly. Well, Ian, thank you so much for this short time that you've spent with us. As always, it's so beneficial and valuable to hear your thoughts about what's happening in the world, whether it's in Canada, about Canada, or any other country in the world. So very much appreciate it. And to our viewers, stay tuned for the findings from our report. Thank you very much.